liberals. The international communist conspiracy in action. During the heat of the fighting in 1966 to 67, the Soviet Union sold to the United States over $2 million worth of magnesium, a metal vital in military aircraft production, when there was a shortage of it in the United States. This occurred at a time when Washington maintained an embargo on supplying communist nations with certain alloys of the same metal. At about the same time, China sold several thousand tons of steel to the United States and South Vietnam for use in the construction of new air and army bases when no one else could meet the American military's urgent need. This, while Washington maintained a boycott on all Chinese products. Even wigs imported into the US from Hong Kong had to be accompanied by a certificate of origin stating that they contained no Chinese hair. The sale of steel may have been only the tip of the iceberg of Chinese sales to the United States during the war. In a visit to China in January 1972, White House envoy Alexander Haig met with Premier Zhou Enlai. Years later, Haig wrote, "Though he never stated the case in so many words, I reported to President Nixon that the import of what Zhou said to me was, 'Don't lose in Vietnam. Don't withdraw from Southeast Asia.'" In 1975, a Senate investigating committee began looking into allegations that the CIA had counterfeited American money during the Vietnam War to finance secret operations. 2 Viet Cong prisoners were interrogated on an airplane flying toward Saigon. The first refused to answer questions and was thrown out of the airplane at 3,000 feet. The second immediately answered all the questions, but he too was thrown out. Variations of the water torture were also used to loosen tongues or simply to torment. Other techniques, usually designed to force onlooking prisoners to talk, involve cutting off the fingers, ears, fingernails, or sexual organs of another prisoner. It is not clear whether these particular Vietnamese were actual prisoners of war, i.e., captured in combat, or whether they were amongst the many thousands of civilians arrested as part of the infamous Phoenix program. Phoenix was the inevitable consequence of fighting a native population. You never knew who was friend, who was enemy. Anyone was a potential informer, bomb thrower, or assassin. Safety demanded that, unless proved otherwise, everyone was to be regarded as the enemy, part of what the CIA called the Viet Cong Infrastructure, VCI. In 1971, CIA officer William Colby, the director of Phoenix, was asked by a congressman, "Are you certain that we know a member of the VCI from a loyal member of the South Vietnam citizenry?" "No, Mr. Congressman," replied Colby. "I am not. Phoenix was a coordinated effort of the United States and South Vietnam to wipe out this infrastructure. Under the program, Vietnamese citizens were rounded up and jailed, often in tiger cages, often tortured, often killed, either in the process of being arrested or subsequently." By Colby's records, during the period between early 1968 and May 1971, 20,587 alleged Viet Cong cadres met their death as a result of the Phoenix program. A similar program, under different names, had existed since 1965 and been run by the United States alone. Colby claims that more than 85% of the 20,587 figure were actually killed in military combat and only identified afterward as members of the VCI. It strains credulity, however, to think that the tens of thousands of Viet Cong killed in combat during this period were picked over, body by body, on the battlefield, for identification and that their connection to the VCI was established. The South Vietnam government credited Phoenix with 40,994 VCI deaths. The true figure will probably never be known. A former U.S. military intelligence officer in Vietnam, K. Barton Osborne, testified before a House committee that suspects caught by Phoenix were interrogated in helicopters and sometimes pushed out. He also spoke of the use of electric shock torture and the insertion into the ear of a 6-inch dowel which was tapped through the brain until the victim died. Osborne's colleague, Michael J. Ewell, testified that most suspects were captured during sweeping tactical raids and that all persons detained were classified as Viet Cong. None of those held for questioning, said Osborne, had ever lived through the process. Arthur Sylvester, Assistant Secretary of Defense for Public Affairs, was the man most responsible for giving, controlling, and managing the war news from Vietnam. One day in July 1965, Sylvester told American journalists that they had a patriotic duty to disseminate only information that made the United States look good. When one of the newsmen exclaimed, "Surely, Arthur, you don't expect the American press to be handmaidens of government," Sylvester replied, "That's exactly what I expect," adding, "Look, if you think any American official is going to tell you the truth, then you're stupid. Did you hear that? Stupid." And when a correspondent for a New York paper began a question, he was interrupted by Sylvester, who said, "Ah, come on. What does someone in New York care about the war in Vietnam?" Meanwhile, hundreds of U.S. servicemen in Asia and Europe were being swindled by phony American auto dealers who turned up to take down payments on cars which they never delivered. Commented an Illinois congressman, "We cannot expect our servicemen to fight to protect the free enterprise system if the very system which they fight to protect takes advantage of them." On January 27, 1973, in Paris, the United States signed the agreement on ending the war and restoring peace in Vietnam. Among the principles to which the United States agreed was the one stated in Article 21. In pursuance of its traditional policy, the United States will contribute to healing the wounds of war and to post-war reconstruction of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, North Vietnam, and throughout Indochina. 5 days later, February 1st, President Nixon sent a message to the Prime Minister of North Vietnam reiterating and expanding upon this pledge. The first two principles put forth in the President's message were: 1. The government of the United States of America will contribute to post-war reconstruction in North Vietnam without any political conditions. 2. Preliminary United States studies indicate that the appropriate programs for the United States contribution to post-war reconstruction will fall in the range of $3.25 billion of grant aid over 5 years. Other forms of aid will be agreed upon between the two parties. This estimate is subject to revision and to detailed discussion between the government of the United States and the government of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. For the next 2 decades, the only aid given to any Vietnamese people by the United States was to those who left Vietnam and those who were infiltrated back in to stir up trouble. At the same time, the U.S. imposed a complete embargo on trade and assistance to the country, which lasted until 1994. Are the victims of the Vietnam War also to be found in generations yet unborn? Tens of millions of gallons of herbicides were unleashed over the country. Included in this were quantities of dioxin, which has been called the most toxic man-made substance known. 3 ounces of dioxin, it is claimed, in the New York City water supply could wipe out the entire populace. Studies in Vietnam since the war have pointed to abnormally high rates of cancers, particularly of the liver, chromosomal damage, birth defects, long-lasting neurological disorders, etc. in the heavily sprayed areas. Other victims were Americans. Thousands of Vietnam veterans fought for years to receive disability compensation, claiming irreparable damage from simply handling the toxic herbicides. After the Second World War, the International Military Tribunal convened at Nuremberg, Germany. Created by the victorious Allies, the tribunal sentenced to prison or execution numerous Nazis who pleaded that they had been only following orders. In an opinion handed down by the tribunal, it declared that the very essence of the tribunal's charter is that individuals have international duties which transcend the national obligations of obedience imposed by the individual state. During the Vietnam War, a number of young Americans refused military service on the grounds that the United States was committing war crimes in Vietnam, and that if they took part in the war, they too, under the principles laid down at Nuremberg, would be guilty of war crimes. One of the most prominent of these cases was that of David Mitchell of Connecticut. At Mitchell's trial in September 1965, Judge William Timbers dismissed his defense as Tamurat and degenerate subversion, and found the Nuremberg principles to be irrelevant to the case. Mitchell was sentenced to prison. Conservative columnist William F. Buckley, Jr., not celebrated as a champion of draft resistance, noted shortly afterward, "I am glad I didn't have Judge Timbers' job. Oh, I could have scolded Mr. Mitchell along with the best of them. But I'd have to cough and wheeze and clear my throat during that passage in my catechism at which I explained to Mr. Mitchell wherein the Nuremberg doctrine was obviously not at his disposal." In 1971, Telford Taylor, the chief United States prosecutor at Nuremberg, suggested rather strongly that General William Westmoreland and high officials of the Johnson administration, such as Robert McNamara and Dean Rusk, could be found guilty of war crimes under criteria established at Nuremberg. Yet every American court and judge, when confronted by the Nuremberg defense, dismissed it without according it any serious consideration whatsoever. The West has never been allowed to forget the Nazi Holocaust. For 55 years, there has been a continuous outpouring of histories, memoirs, novels, feature films, documentaries, television series, played and replayed in every Western language. There have been museums, memorial sculptures, photo exhibitions, remembrance ceremonies. Never again. But who hears the voice of the Vietnamese peasant? Who has access to the writings of the Vietnamese intellectual? What was the fate of the Vietnamese and Frank? Where, asks the young American, is Vietnam? 20. Cambodia 1955 to 1973. Prince Sihanouk walks the high wire of neutralism. John Foster Dulles had called on me in his capacity as Secretary of State, and he had exhausted every argument to persuade me to place Cambodia under the protection of the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization. I refused. I considered SEATO an aggressive military alliance directed against neighbors whose ideology I did not share but with whom Cambodia had no quarrel. I had made all this quite clear to John Foster, an acidy, arrogant man, but his brother, CIA Director Alan Dulles, soon turned up with a briefcase full of documents proving that Cambodia was about to fall victim to communist aggression, and that the only way to save the country, the monarchy and myself, was to accept the protection of SEATO. The proofs did not coincide with my own information, and I replied to Alan Dulles as I had replied to John Foster. Cambodia wanted no part of SEATO. We would look after ourselves as neutrals and Buddhists. There was nothing for the Secret Service chief to do but pack up his dubious documents and leave. Prince Norodom Sihanouk in his memoirs. The visits of the brothers Dulles in 1955 appear to have been the opening salvos in a campaign of extraordinary measures aimed at pressuring the charismatic Cambodian leader into aligning his nation with the West and joining the holy war against communism. The coercion continued intermittently until 1970, when Sihanouk was finally overthrown in an American-backed coup and the United States invaded Cambodia. In March 1956, after Sihanouk had visited Peking and criticized SEATO, the two countries which sandwich Cambodia, Thailand and South Vietnam, both heavily dependent upon and allied with the United States, suddenly closed their borders. It was a serious move, for the bulk of Cambodia's traffic with the outside world at that time passed either along the Mekong River through South Vietnam or by railway through Thailand. The danger to the tiny kingdom was heightened by repeated military provocations. Thai troops invaded Cambodian territory and CIA-financed irregulars began to make commando raids from South Vietnam. Deep intrusions were made into Cambodian airspace by planes based in the two countries. To Sihanouk, these actions looked more and more like preliminary softening up probes for his overthrow. He chose to thrust matters out into the open. At a press conference, he scolded the US, defended Cambodia's policy of neutrality, and announced that the whole question would be on the agenda of his party's upcoming National Congress. There was the implication that Cambodia would turn to the Socialist Bloc for aid. The United States appeared to retreat in the face of this unorthodox public diplomacy. The State Department sent a couple of rather conciliatory messages which nullified a threatened cutoff of certain economic aid and included this remarkable piece of altruism. The only aim of American policy to Cambodia is to help her strengthen and defend her independence. 2 days before the National Congress convened, Thailand and South Vietnam opened their frontiers. The local disputes which the two countries had cited as the reasons for the blockade had not been resolved at all. The measures taken against Cambodia were counterproductive. Not only did Sihanouk continue to attack SEATO, but he established relations with the Soviet Union and Poland and accepted aid from China. He praised the latter lavishly for treating Cambodia as an equal and for providing aid without all the strings which, he felt, came attached to American aid. Such behavior should not obscure the fact that Sihanouk was as genuine a neutralist as one could be in such a highly polarized region of the world in the midst of the Cold War. He did not shy away from denouncing China, North Vietnam, or communism on a number of occasions when he felt that Cambodia's security or neutrality was being threatened. "I foresee perfectly well," he said at one time, "the collapse of an independent and neutral Cambodia after the complete triumph of communism in Laos and South Vietnam." In May 1957, a National Security Council (NSC) paper acknowledged that the United States has been unable to influence Cambodia in the direction of a stable, i.e., pro-Western government, and non-involvement in the communist bloc. The following year, 5 battalions of Saigon troops, supported by aircraft, crossed the Cambodian border again, penetrated to a depth of almost 10 miles, and began putting up new boundary markers. Sihanouk's impulse was to try and repel the invaders, but, to his amazement, he was informed by the American ambassador to Cambodia, Karl Strom, that U.S. military aid was provided exclusively for the purpose of opposing communist aggression, and in no case could be used against an American ally. The ambassador cautioned that if a single bullet were fired at the South Vietnamese or a single U.S. supplied truck used to transport Cambodian troops to a military confrontation with them, this would constitute grounds for canceling aid. Ambassador Strom was called back to Washington, told that Sihanouk would now have to go and that U.S. aid would be cut off to precipitate his fall. Strom, however, did not think that this was the wisest move to make at that point and was able to convince the State Department to hold off for the time being. William Shawcross, in his elaborately researched book, Sideshow, Kissinger, Nixon, and the Destruction of Cambodia, notes that NSC papers of the period cited in the Pentagon Papers confirm that Washington saw Thai and Vietnamese pressure across the borders as one of the principal weapons to be used in an effort to move Sihanouk toward a more pro-American position. In addition to Thai and South Vietnamese troops, the CIA had at its disposal 2 other forces, the Khmer Syrii and the Khmer Krom, composed largely of ethnic Cambodians opposed to Sihanouk's rule, who operated out of the 2 neighboring countries. The Khmer Syrii, Free Cambodians, were described by Shawcross as the Cambodian organization with which American officials had had the closest contact. Sihanouk once equated them to the Free Cubans the United States maintained in Florida. These forces, recruited, financed, armed, and trained by the CIA and the U.S. Special Forces Green Berets, began to infiltrate into Cambodia in the latter part of 1958 as part of a complex conspiracy which included, amongst others, a disloyal Cambodian general named Dap Chuan who was plotting an armed uprising inside the country. At its most optimistic, the conspiracy aimed at overthrowing Sihanouk. Sihanouk discovered the plan, partly through reports from Chinese and French intelligence. The French were not happy about the American intrusion into what had been their domain for close to a century. By February 1959, the conspirators had been apprehended or had fled, including Victor Masao Matsui, a member of the CIA station in Cambodia's capital city Phnom Penh, who hurriedly left the country after Sihanouk accused him of being a party to the plot. Matsui, an American of Japanese descent, had been operating under State Department cover as an attaché at the embassy. The intrigue, according to Sihanouk, began in September 1958 at a SEATO meeting in Thailand and was carried a step further later that month in New York when he visited the United Nations. While Sihanouk was away in Washington for a few days, a member of his delegation, Slat Piu, held several conferences with Americans in his New York hotel room, which he did not mention to any of his fellow delegates. Slat Piu, it happened, was a close friend of Victor Matsui and was the brother of General Dap Chuan. In the aftermath of the aborted conspiracy, Slat Piu was executed for treason. Sihanouk was struck by the bitter irony of the CIA plotting against him in New York while he was in Washington being honored by President Eisenhower with a 21-gun salute. In a similar vein, several years later President Kennedy assured Sihanouk on his honor that the United States had played no role in the affairs of the Khmer Syrii. "I considered President Kennedy to be an honorable man," wrote Sihanouk, "but, in that case, who really represented the American government?" CIA officer, later director, William Colby, stationed in Vietnam at the time of the Dap Chuan plot, has written that the agency was well aware of the plot and had recruited someone on Dap Chuan's staff and furnished him with a radio with which to keep the CIA informed. The agency wanted to be kept informed, Colby asserts, in order to dissuade the Thai and Vietnamese from overthrowing Sihanouk. Colby adds, "Unfortunately, in putting down the coup, Sihanouk had captured our agent and his radio. And, not unnaturally, he drew the conclusion that CIA was one of the participants, and that the gold and arms furnished from Bangkok and Saigon to be used against him were only part of the overall plot of which the radio was a key element. The Cambodian leader has attested to several other plots he lays at the doorstep of the CIA. Amongst these was a 1959 effort to murder him which was foiled when the police picked a nervous young man, Rat Vat by name, out of a crowd surrounding Sihanouk. He was found to be carrying a hand grenade and a pistol. Investigation showed, writes Sihanouk, that the would-be assassin was instigated by the CIA and the Khmer Syrii. Sihanouk also cites 3 incidents occurring in 1963. An attempt to blow up a car carrying him and the visiting president of China, Liu Shaoqi. An attempt to smuggle arms into Cambodia in a number of crates addressed to the US Embassy. And a partially successful venture aimed at sabotaging the Cambodian economy and subverting key government personnel through the setting up of a bank in Phnom Penh. On November 20th of the same year, 2 days before the assassination of John F. Kennedy, the Cambodian National Congress, at Sihanouk's initiative, voted to end all aid granted by the United States in the military, economic, technical, and cultural fields. It was perhaps without precedent that a country receiving American aid voluntarily repudiated it. But Sihanouk held strong feelings on the subject. Over the years, he had frequently recited from his register of complaints about American aid to Cambodia, how it subverted and corrupted Cambodian officials and businessmen who wound up constituting a clientele necessarily obedient to the demands of the lavish bestower of foreign funds, and how the aid couldn't be used for state institutions, only private enterprise, nor, as mentioned earlier, used against attacks by US allies. After some American bombings of Cambodian villages near the South Vietnam border in pursuit of North Vietnamese and Viet Cong, the Cambodian government, in October 1964, announced that in case of any new violation of Cambodian territory by US ground, air, or naval forces, Cambodia will immediately sever diplomatic relations with the United States. The government did just that the following May when American planes bombarded several villages, killing or wounding dozens of peasants. The pattern over the next few years, as the war in Indochina intensified, was one of repeated forays into Cambodian territory by American, Saigon, and Khmer Syrii forces in search of communist supply lines and sanctuaries along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Bombing and strafing, napalming, and placing landmines, with varying numbers of Cambodian civilian casualties, angry accusations by the Cambodian government, followed on occasion by an American apology, promise of an investigation, and the taking of measures to prevent any recurrence of such incidents. Sihanouk did not at all relish the intrusions into Cambodia by the Vietnamese communists, nor was he wholly or consistently antagonistic to American pursuit of them, particularly when there was no loss of Cambodian lives. On at least one occasion, he disclosed the location of communist bases which were promptly bombed by the US. However, Sihanouk then went on the radio and proceeded to denounce the bombings. Opportunist that he often revealed himself to be, Sihanouk was nonetheless truly caught between the devil and the deep blue sea, and by the late 1960s his predicament had compelled him to resume American aid and re-establish diplomatic relations with the United States. Despite all the impulsiveness of his personality and policies, Sihanouk's neutralist high-wire balancing act did successfully shield his country from the worst of the devastation that was sweeping through the land and people of Vietnam and Laos. Cambodia had its own communist insurgents, the Khmer Rouge, who surely would have unleashed a full-scale civil war if faced with a Cambodian government nestled comfortably in the American camp. This is precisely what later came to pass following the overthrow of Sihanouk and his replacement by Lon Nol, who was closely tied to the United States. In March 1969, the situation began to change dramatically. Under the new American president, Richard Nixon, and National Security Affairs Advisor Henry Kissinger, the isolated and limited attacks across the Cambodian border became sustained. Large-scale B-52 bombings, carpet bombings, in the euphemistic language so dear to the hearts of military men. Over the next 14 months, no less than 3,630 B-52 bombing raids were flown over Cambodia. To escape the onslaught, the Vietnamese communists moved their bases further inside the country. The B-52s, of course, followed, with a concomitant increase in civilian casualties. The Nixon administration artfully played down the nature and extent of these bombings, going so far as to falsify military records, and was largely successful in keeping it all a secret from the American public, the press, and Congress. Not until 1973, in the midst of the Watergate revelations, did a fuller story begin to emerge. It was frequently argued that the United States had every right to attack Cambodia because of its use as a sanctuary by America's foes in Vietnam. Apropos of this claim, William Shawcross has pointed out that During the Algerian War of Independence, the United States rejected France's claimed right to attack a Tunisian town inhabited by Algerian guerrillas, and in 1964 Adlai Stevenson, at the UN, condemned Britain for assaulting a Yemeni town used as a base by insurgents attacking Aden. Even Israel had frequently been criticized by the United States for attacks on enemy bases outside its territory. On March 18, 1970, Sihanouk, while on a trip abroad, was deposed as head of state by two of his leading ministers, Lon Nol and Sirik Matak. To what extent, if any, the United States played a direct role in the coup has not been established, but there are circumstances and testimony pointing to American complicity, among which are the following. According to Frank Snepp, the CIA's principal political analyst in Vietnam at this time, in early 1970 the agency was cultivating both Lon Nol and Sun Ngoc Ton, leader of the Khmer Syrii, as possible replacements for Sihanouk. The CIA believed, he says, that if Lon Nol came to power, he would welcome the United States with open arms and we would accomplish everything. This, presumably, meant carte blanche to wipe out Vietnamese communist forces and sanctuaries in Cambodia, as opposed to Sihanouk's extremely equivocal position on the matter. Both men, as matters turned out, served as prime minister in the new government, for which diplomatic recognition was immediately forthcoming from Washington. The United States could seemingly also rely on Sirik Matak, a committed anti-communist who had been profiled by the Pentagon's Defense Intelligence Agency as a friend of the West and cooperative with U.S. officials during the 1950s. Investigative journalist Seymour Hersh, in his biographic work on Kissinger, states that Sihanouk's immediate overthrow had been for years a high priority of the Green Berets reconnaissance units operating inside Cambodia since the late 1960s. There is also incontrovertible evidence that Lon Nol was approached by agents of American military intelligence in 1969 and asked to overthrow the Sihanouk government. Sihanouk made similar charges in his 1973 memoir, My War with the CIA, but they were not taken seriously then. An opponent of Sihanouk, Pram Naz, who became a minister in the new government, has said that whether Lon Nol had specific promises of American help before the coup is unimportant. We all just knew that the United States would help us. There had been many stories of CIA approaches and offers before then. The CIA's intimate links to the conspiratorial circle are exemplified by an agency report prepared 6 days before the coup, entitled Indications of Possible Coup in Phnom Penh. It disclosed that anti-communist demonstrations against the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese embassies in the capital the previous day had been planned by Sirik Matak and Lon Nol as part of a showdown policy against Sihanouk and his followers, and that the two men had put the army on alert to prepare for a coup against Sihanouk if Sihanouk refused to support them. General William Rawson, deputy to General Creighton Abrams, the commander of U.S. forces in Vietnam at the time, has declared that American commanders were informed several days beforehand that a coup was being planned and that United States support was solicited. Roger Morris, who was serving under Henry Kissinger on the National Security Council staff when the coup took place, reported that it was clear in the White House that the CIA station in Phnom Penh knew the plotters well, probably knew their plans, and did nothing to alert Sihanouk. They informed Washington well in advance of the coup. William Shawcross asserts that had Sihanouk returned quickly and calmly to Phnom Penh, following the anti-communist demonstrations, he would most likely have been able to avert disaster. That he did not do so may not have been by chance. Frank Snepp has revealed that the CIA persuaded Sihanouk's mother, the Queen, to send a message to her son abroad reassuring him that the situation was not serious enough to warrant his return. With Sihanouk and his irritating neutralism no longer an obstacle, American military wheels began to spin. Within hours of the coup, U.S. and South Vietnam forces stationed in border districts were directed to establish communication with Cambodian commanders on the other side and take steps toward military cooperation. The next day, the Cambodian army called in an American spotter plane and South Vietnamese artillery during a sweep of a Viet Cong sanctuary by a battalion of Cambodian troops inside Cambodia. The New York Times declared that the battle appeared to be the most determined Cambodian effort yet to drive the Viet Cong out of border areas. The Great Cambodian War had begun. It was to persist for 5 terrible years. The enemy confronting the United States and its Saigon and Phnom Penh allies was now not simply the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong. The Cambodian communists, the Khmer Rouge, under the leadership of Pol Pot, had entered the conflict, as had sundry Cambodian supporters of Prince Sihanouk. On April 30th, 1970, the first full-scale American invasion of the new war was launched. It produced a vast outcry of protest in the United States, rocking university campuses from coast to coast. Perhaps the most extraordinary reaction was the angry resignations of 4 men from Henry Kissinger's National Security Council staff, including Roger Morris. Kissinger labeled the resignations as the cowardice of the Eastern establishment. By the end of May, scores of villages had been reduced to rubble and ashes by U.S. air power. The long train of Cambodian refugees had begun their march. 3 years and more than 100,000 tons of bombs later, January 27, 1973 to be precise, an agreement was signed in Paris putting an end to a decade of American warfare in Vietnam. The bombing of Cambodia, however, continued. Prior to the Paris Agreement, the official position of the Nixon administration, repeatedly asserted, was that the sole purpose of bombing Cambodia was to protect American lives in Vietnam. Yet now, the U.S. not only did not cease the bombing, it increased it in a last desperate attempt to keep the Khmer Rouge from coming to power. During March, April, and May, the tonnage of bombs unloosed over Cambodia was more than double that of the entire previous year. The society's traditional economy had vanished. The old Cambodia was being destroyed forever. Under increasing pressure from Congress, the Nixon administration finally ended the bombing in August. More than 2 million Cambodians had been made homeless. It does appear rather ludicrous in the light of this application of brute force that the CIA was at the same time carrying out the most subtle of psychological tactics, to spread dissatisfaction about the exiled Sihanouk amongst the Cambodian peasantry who revered him. A CIA sound engineer, using sophisticated electronics, fashioned an excellent counterfeit of the prince's distinctive voice and manner of speaking, breathless, high-pitched, and full of giggles. This voice was beamed from a clandestine radio station in Laos with messages artfully designed to offend any good Cambodian. In one of the broadcasts, Sihanouk exhorted young women to aid the cause by sleeping with the valiant Viet Cong. In a farewell press conference in September 1973, the American ambassador to Cambodia, Emery Swank, called what had taken place there Indochina's most useless war. Later, California Congressman Pete McCloskey, following a visit to Cambodia, had harsher words. He was moved to declare that what the United States had done to the country is greater evil than we have done to any country in the world, and wholly without reason, except for our own benefit to fight against the Vietnamese. On April 17, 1975, the Khmer Rouge entered Phnom Penh in victory. 2 weeks later, Saigon fell to the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong. Incredibly, the Khmer Rouge were to inflict even greater misery upon this unhappy land. And to add to the irony, or to multiply it, the United States supported the Khmer Rouge after their subsequent defeat by the Vietnamese, both by defending their right to the United Nations Cambodian seat and in their military struggle against the Cambodian government and its Vietnamese allies. In November 1980, Ray Klein, former deputy director of the CIA, visited a Khmer Rouge enclave in Cambodia in his capacity as senior foreign policy advisor to President-elect Ronald Reagan. The Khmer Rouge press release spoke of the visit in warm terms. This was in keeping with the Reagan administration's subsequent opposition to the Vietnamese-supported Phnom Penh government. A lingering bitter hatred of Vietnam by unreconstructed American Cold Warriors appears to be the only explanation for this policy. 21. Laos 1957 to 1973. L'armée clandestine. For the past 2 years, the U.S. has carried out one of the most sustained bombing campaigns in history against essentially civilian targets in northeastern Laos. Operating from Thai bases and from aircraft carriers, American jets have destroyed the great majority of villages and towns in the northeast. Severe casualties have been inflicted upon the inhabitants. Refugees from the Plain of Jars report they were bombed almost daily by American jets last year. They say they spent most of the past 2 years living in caves or holes. Far Eastern Economic Review, Hong Kong, 1970. The Laos operation is something of which we can be proud as Americans. It has involved virtually no American casualties. What we are getting for our money there is, I think, to use the old phrase, very cost-effective. Ooh. Alexis Johnson, U.S. Under Secretary of State, 1971. The United States undertook the bombing campaign because its ground war against the Pathet Lao had failed. The ground war had been carried out because the Pathet Lao were led by people whom the State Department categorized as communist. No more, no less. The Pathet Lao turned to warfare because of their experiences in working within the system. In 1957, the Pathet Lao, Lao Nation, held 2 ministerial posts in the coalition government of National Union. This was during John Foster Dulles' era, and if there was anything the fanatic Secretary of State hated more than neutralism, it was a coalition with communists. This government featured both. There could be little other reason for the development of the major American intervention into this impoverished and primitive land of peasants. The American ambassador to Laos at the time, J. Graham Parsons, was to admit later, "I struggled for 16 months to prevent a coalition." In addition to its demand for inclusion in the coalition government, the Pathet Lao had called for diplomatic relations with the countries of the Soviet bloc and the acceptance of aid from them, as was already the case with Western nations. Agreement to these conditions, said Washington, would have given the communists their most significant gains in Southeast Asia since the partition of Indochina. Others would say that the Pathet Lao's conditions were simply what neutralism is all about. In May 1958, the Pathet Lao and other leftists, running a campaign based on government corruption and indifference, won 13 of 21 contested seats for the National Assembly and wound up controlling more than 1/3 of the new legislature. 2 months later, however, Prime Minister Sovana Foma, a man universally categorized as a neutralist, resigned to form a new government which would exclude the Pathet Lao ministers. He subsequently claimed that he was forced to resign due to continued American opposition to Laotian neutrality. As it happened, one Foy Sinanakone, backed by the US, became premier in the reorganized government. Then, in January 1959, the non-left majority in the National Assembly voted, in effect, to dissolve the Assembly in order to counteract communist influence and subversion. The left was now altogether excluded from the government, and the elections scheduled for December were canceled. If this wasn't enough to disenchant the Pathet Lao or anyone else with the Laotian political process, there was, in the late 1950s and early 1960s, the spectacle of a continuous parade of coups and counter-coups, of men overthrown winding up in the new government, and regimes headed by men who had sided with the French in their war against Indochinese independence, while the Pathet Lao had fought against the colonialists. There were as well government-rigged elections, with the CIA stuffing ballot boxes. Different regimes come warlords governing simultaneously from different capitals, their armies fighting each other, switching allies and enemies when it suited them. Hundreds of millions of US dollars pouring into a tiny kingdom which was 99% agricultural, with an economy based more on barter than money, the result being unimaginable bribery, graft, currency manipulation, and waste. The CIA and the State Department alone could take credit for engineering coups through force, bribery, or other pressures, at least once in each of the years 1958, 1959, and 1960, if not in others. By merely withholding the monthly payment to the troops, wrote Roger Hilsman, whose career encompassed both agencies, perhaps covertly simultaneously, the United States could create the conditions for toppling any Lao government whose policies it opposed. As it turned out, in fact, the United States used this weapon twice, to bring down the government of one Lao leader and to break the will of another. The American wheeling and dealing centered around giving power to the CIA's hand-picked rightist strongman Phumi Nosavin, ousting Sovana Foma and other neutralists, and jailing Pathet Lao leaders, including the movement's head, Suphanuvong, the half-brother of Sovana Foma, both being princes of the royal family. Suphanuvong insisted that neither he nor the Pathet Lao were communist, but were rather ultranationalist. Crucial to understanding his statements, of course, is the question of exactly what he meant by the term communist. This is not clear, but neither is it clear what the State Department meant when it referred to him as such. The Pathet Lao were the only sizable group in the country serious about social change, a characteristic which of course tends to induce Washington officials to apply the communist label. In August 1960, Kong Lu, a military officer with his own troop following, staged a coup and set up a neutralist government under Sovana Foma, rejecting Pathet Lao help. But when this government became a casualty of a CIA coup in December, Kong Lu allied himself with the Pathet Lao. Later, he turned to the United States for aid and fought against the Pathet Lao. Such was the way of the Laotian circus. No study of Laos of this period appears to have had notable success in untangling the muddle of who exactly replaced whom, and when, and how, and why. After returning from Laos, writer Norman Cousins stated in 1961 that, if you want to get a sense of the universe unraveling, come to Laos. Complexity such as this has to be respected. One thing that came through unambiguously, however, was the determination of the United States to save Laos from communism and neutralism. To this end, the CIA set about creating its now famous Armée Clandestine, a process begun by the U.S. Army in the mid-1950s when it organized Mio Hill tribesmen, the same ethnic group organized in Vietnam. Over the years, other peoples of Laos were added, reaching at least 30,000 in the mid-1960s, half of them more or less full-time soldiers. Many thousands more from Thailand. Hundreds of other Asians came on board, South Vietnamese, Filipinos, Taiwanese, South Koreans, men who had received expert training from their American mentors in their home countries for other wars, now being recycled. An army, said the New York Times, armed, equipped, fed, paid, guided, strategically and tactically, and often transported into and out of action by the United States, trained and augmented by the CIA, and by men of every branch of the U.S. military with their multiple specialties. The many pilots of the CIA's Air America, altogether some 2,000 Americans in and over Laos, and thousands more in Asia helping with the logistics. A secret army, secret, that is, from the American people and Congress. U.S. military personnel were there under various covers, some as civilians in mufti, having resigned from the service for the occasion and been hired by a private company created by the CIA. Others served as embassy attaches. CIA pilots were officially under contract to the Agency for International Development Aid. Americans who were killed in Laos were reported to have died in Vietnam. All this in addition to the official government forces, the Royal Laotian Army, greatly expanded and totally paid for by the United States. Laos was an American plantation, a CIA playground. During the 1960s, the agency roamed over much of the land at will, building an airstrip, a hangar, or a base here, a warehouse, barracks, or a radar site there. Relocating thousands of people, entire villages, whole tribes, to suit strategic military needs. Recruiting warriors through money and or the threat or use of force and or promises of independent kingdoms which it had no intention of fulfilling, and then keeping them fighting long beyond the point when they wished to stop. While the legendary pilots of Air America roamed far and wide as well, hard-drinking, daredevil flying, death-defying, great stories to tell the guys back home if you survived. Some of the stories had to do with drugs. Flying opium and heroin all over Indochina to serve the personal and entrepreneurial needs of the CIA's various military and political allies, ultimately turning numerous GIs in Vietnam into addicts. The operation was not a paragon of discretion. Heroin was refined in a laboratory located on the site of CIA headquarters in northern Laos. After a decade of American military intervention, Southeast Asia had become the source of 70% of the world's illicit opium and the major supplier of raw materials for America's booming heroin market. At the same time, the hearts and minds of the Laotian people, at least of those who could read, were not overlooked. The U.S. Information Agency was there to put out a magazine with a circulation of 43,000. This in a country where the circulation of the largest newspaper was 3,300. There were as well USIA wall newspapers, films, leaflet drops, and radio programs. In the face of it all, the Pathet Lao more than held their own. The CIA was overextended, and unlike the motley band of Asians assembled by the agency, the soldiers of the Pathet Lao had some idea of what they were fighting for. The Soviet Union, aware of what the United States was doing in Laos, even if the American public was not, was alarmed by the establishment of a pro-American government in the country, and acceded to a Cold War near reflex by sending military supplies to the Pathet Lao, though nothing remotely on the order of the U.S. commitment. Beginning in the early 1960s, the North Vietnamese were aiding them as well. Hanoi's overriding interest in Laos was not necessarily the creation of a communist state, but the prevention of a belligerent government on its border. In January 1961, the New York Times reported that many Western diplomats in Vientiane, capital of Laos, feel the communists would have been content to leave Laos alone provided she remained neutral and outside the United States' sphere of influence. Hanoi was concerned not only by the American political and military operations in Laos, but by the actions of U.S. Special Forces teams which were entering North Vietnam to engage in espionage, sabotage, and assassination, and by the bombings of the country being carried out by the U.S. Air Force at a time when the war in South Vietnam was still but a shadow of what was to come. Later, as the wars in Vietnam and Laos became intertwined, Laos formed part of the Ho Chi Minh Trail, the principal route by which Hanoi supplied its comrades in South Vietnam, and the North Vietnamese fought to protect it as well as attacking American radar installations in Laos used to aid U.S. bombing of North Vietnam. The nature and extent of North Vietnam's aid to the Pathet Lao before this period is difficult to ascertain from Western sources, because such charges typically emanated from the Laotian government or the State Department. On a number of occasions, their report of a North Vietnamese military operation in Laos turned out to be a fabrication. William Lederer and Eugene Burdick, in A Nation of Sheep, summarized one of these non-events from the summer of 1959. The people of the United States were led to believe that Laos physically had been invaded by foreign communist troops from across its northern border. Our Secretary of State called the situation grave. Our ambassador to the UN called for world action. Our press carried scare headlines. Our senior naval officer implied armed intervention and was seconded by ranking congressmen. The entire affair was a fraud. No military invasion of Laos had taken place. There seemed no doubt that a war embracing thousands of troops, tanks, planes, and mass battles was raging. Regardless of how the accounts were worded, this was the picture given the nation. The Laotian government and the large American establishment in Laos, each for their own reasons, were not about to let the golden goose slip away that easily. On the last day of 1960, the Laotian government announced to the world that 7 battalions of North Vietnamese troops had invaded the country. By all accounts, and by the utter lack of evidence, this claim as well cannot be taken seriously. And in 1962, reported Bernard Fall, the renowned French scholar on Indochina. After a battle between government forces and the Pathet Lao, in spite of the fact that Colonel Edwin Elder, the American commander in the area of the battle, immediately stated that there was no evidence to show that Chinese or North Vietnamese had participated in the attack, the Laotians, and much of the U.S. press, and official Washington with them, immediately claimed that they were again faced with a large-scale foreign invasion. Shortly after Kennedy became president in January 1961, he made a sustained diplomatic effort to establish a coalition government in Laos, precisely what the Eisenhower administration and the CIA had done their best to sabotage. Although he sometimes fell back on conventional Cold War rhetoric when speaking of Laos, one part of John F. Kennedy realized the absurdity of fighting for the backward country, a land he considered not worthy of engaging the attention of great powers. Soviet Premier Khrushchev, for his part, was reportedly bored with the question of Laos, and irritably asked Kennedy's emissary why Washington bothered so much about the country. Eventually, in July 1962, a multi-nation conference in Geneva signed an agreement for a coalition government in Laos. But in the mountains and the plains of the country, this was no longer a viable option. The CIA had too much time, effort, material, and emotion invested in its secret army. It was the best war the agency had going anywhere. It was great adventure. And the Pathet Lao were much stronger now than a few years earlier. They were not about to buy such shop-worn, suspect goods again, although everyone went through the motions. Both sides regularly accused each other of violating the agreement, and not without justification. The North Vietnamese, for example, did not withdraw all of their troops from Laos, while the U.S. left behind all manner of military personnel, American and Asian, who remained under aid and other civilian cover, but this was nonetheless a violation of the agreement. Moreover, Christopher Robbins, in his study of Air America, has noted that U.S. military advisors and CIA personnel moved across the border into Thailand, where they were flown in every day to Laos like commuters by Air America, whose entire helicopter operation was based in Udorn, Thailand. Air America, by the early 1970s, had no less than 4,000 employees in Thailand. Thus it was that the fighting dragged on, though only sporadically. In April 1964, the coalition government, such as it was overthrown by the right wing, with the CIA's man Phumi Nosavan emerging as part of a rightist government headed by the perennial survivor Sovana Phoma to give it a neutralist fig leaf. The Pathet Lao were once again left out in the cold. For them, it was the very last straw. The fighting greatly intensified, the skirmishes were now war, and the Pathet Lao offensive soon scored significant advances. Then the American bombing began. Between 1965 and 1973, more than 2 million tons of bombs rained down upon the people of Laos, considerably more than the US had dropped on both Germany and Japan during the Second World War, albeit for a shorter period. For the first few years, the bombing was directed primarily at the provinces controlled by the Pathet Lao. Of the bombing, Fred Bramfman, a former American community worker in Laos, wrote, "Village after village was leveled, countless people buried alive by high explosives, or burned alive by napalm and white phosphorus, or riddled by anti-personnel bomb pellets. The United States has undertaken," said a Senate report, "a large-scale air war over Laos to destroy the physical and social infrastructure of Pathet Lao-held areas and to interdict North Vietnamese infiltration. Throughout all this, there has been a policy of subterfuge and secrecy. Through such things as saturation bombing and the forced evacuation of population from enemy-held or threatened areas, we have helped to create untold agony for hundreds of thousands of villagers. The American military, however, kept proper records. Aid could report to Congress that wounds suffered by civilian war casualties were as follows. 1. Type, soft tissue, 39%. Compound fracture, 30%. Amputation, 12%. Intra-abdominal, 10%. Intrathoracic, 3%. Intracranial, 1%. 2. Location, lower extremities, 60%. Upper extremities, 15%. Trunk, 18%. Head, 7%. There was no happy way out for the Laotian people. In October 1971, one could read in The Guardian of London, "Although US officials deny it vehemently, ample evidence exists to confirm charges that the Mio villages that do try to find their own way out of the war, even if it is simply by staying neutral and refusing to send their 13-year-olds to fight in the CIA Army, are immediately denied American rice and transport and ultimately bombed by the US Air Force. The fledgling society that the United States was trying to make extinct, the CIA dropped millions of dollars in forged Pathet Lao currency as well in an attempt to wreck the economy, was one which Fred Bramfman described thus. The Pathet Lao rule over the Plain of Jars, begun in May 1964, brought its people into a post-colonial era. For the first time, they were taught pride in their country and people instead of admiration for a foreign culture. Schooling and massive adult literacy campaigns were conducted in Laotian instead of French, and mild but thorough social revolution, ranging from land reform to greater equality for women, was instituted. Following on the heels of events in Vietnam, a ceasefire was arrived at in Laos in 1973, and yet another attempt at coalition government was undertaken. This one lasted until 1975 when, after renewed fighting, the Pathet Lao took over full control of the country. Laos had become a land of nomads, without villages, without farms. A generation of refugees, hundreds of thousands dead, many more maimed. When the US Air Force closed down its radio station, it signed off with the message, "Goodbye and see you next war." Thus it was that the worst of Washington's fears had come to pass. All of Indochina, Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos had fallen to the communists. During the initial period of US involvement in Indochina in the 1950s, John Foster Dulles, Dwight Eisenhower, and other American officials regularly issued doomsday pronouncements of the type known as the domino theory, warning that if Indochina should fall, other nations in Asia would topple over as well. In one instance, President Eisenhower listed no less than Taiwan, Australia, New Zealand, the Philippines, and Indonesia amongst the anticipated falling dominoes. Such warnings were repeated periodically over the next decade by succeeding administrations and other supporters of US policy in Indochina as a key argument in defense of such policy. The fact that these ominous predictions turned out to have no basis in reality did not deter Washington officialdom from promulgating the same dogma up until the 1990s about almost each New World trouble spot, testimony to their unshakable faith in the existence and interworkings of the international communist conspiracy.
22. Haiti 1959 1963.
The Marines land, again. Duvalier has performed an economic miracle, remarked a Haitian of his country's dictator. He has taught us to live without money, to eat without food, to live without life. And when Francois Papa Doc Duvalier's voodoo magic wore thin, He could always count on the U.S. Marines to continue his people's education. During the night of 12 to 13 August 1959, a boat landed on the northern coast of Haiti with a reported 30 men, Haitians and Cubans, and perhaps others aboard. The men had set sail from Cuba some 50 miles away. Their purpose was to overthrow the tyrannical Haitian government, a regime whose secret police, it was said, outnumbered its army. In short order, the raiding party, equipped with heavy weapons, captured a small army post and began to recruit and arm villagers for the cause. The government reported that about 200 persons had joined them. Haitian exiles in Venezuela, in an apparently coordinated effort, broadcast appeals to their countrymen to aid the invaders. They set at 120 the number of men who had landed in Haiti, although this appears to be an exaggeration. The initial reaction of the Duvalier government was one of panic, and the police began rounding up opposition sympathizers. It was at this point that the U.S. military mission in Haiti to train Duvalier's forces stepped in. The Americans instituted an air and sea reconnaissance to locate the rebels. Haitian soldiers, accompanied by U.S. Marines, were airlifted to the area and went into the field to do battle with them. 2 other U.S. Navy planes and a helicopter arrived from Puerto Rico. According to their commander, Colonel Robert Debs Heinel, Jr., the American Marines took part in the fighting, which lasted until August 22nd. The outcome was a complete rout of the rebel forces. Information about the men who came from Cuba derives almost exclusively from the Haitian government and the American military mission. These sources claim that the raiding party was composed of about 30 men and that, with the exception of 1 or 2 Haitians who led them, they were all Cubans. Another report, referred to in the New York Times, stated that there were 10 Haitians and 2 Venezuelans amongst the 30 invaders. The latter ratio is probably closer to the truth, for there was a considerable number of Haitian exiles living in Cuba, many of whom had gained military experience during the recent Cuban Revolution. For obvious reasons of international politics and fighting incentive, such men were the most likely candidates to be part of an invasion of their homeland. The Castro government readily admitted that the raiding party had come from Cuba, but denied that the government had known or approved of it. This claim would seem rather suspect were it not for the fact that the Cuban Coast Guard had thwarted a similar undertaking in April. The first members of the American military mission had arrived in Haiti in January, largely in response to another invasion attempt the previous July, originating probably in the Dominican Republic. Regardless of all the horror stories about the Haitian regime, such as the one Colonel Heinel tells of his 12-year-old son being arrested when he was overheard expressing sympathy for a group of hungry peasants he saw. Duvalier was Washington's man. After all was said and done, he could be counted upon to keep his black nation, which was usually accorded the honor of being Latin America's poorest, from turning red. Heinel has recounted the instructions he received from a State Department undersecretary in January. Colonel, the most important way you can support our objectives in Haiti is to help keep Duvalier in power so he can serve out his full term in office, and maybe a little longer than that if everything works out. The Kennedy administration, which came to power in January 1961, had little use for Papa Doc and supported his overthrow as well as his possible assassination. According to the later testimony of CIA official Walter Elder before a Senate investigating committee, the agency furnished arms to Haitian dissidents seeking to topple the dictator. Elder added that while the assassination of Duvalier was not contemplated, the arms were provided to help the dissidents take what measures were deemed necessary to replace the government. And it was realized, he said, that Duvalier might be killed in the course of the overthrow. But as Cuba increasingly became the United States bête noire, the CIA's great obsession, Washington's policy changed. Haiti's cooperation was needed for the success of U.S. efforts to have Cuba expelled from the Organization of American States in 1963. From that point on, Duvalier enjoyed the full diplomatic and economic support of the U.S. When the Haitian leader died on April 12, 1971, the American ambassador Clinton Knox was the only diplomat present at the midnight swearing-in of 19-year-old Jean-Claude Baby Doc Duvalier as the new president for life, who was to receive the same economic, political, and military support as had Papa Doc, with only the occasional hiccup of a protest from Washington when the level of repression became difficult to ignore. 23. Guatemala, 1960. One good coup deserves another. In November 1960, as John F. Kennedy was preparing to succeed Dwight Eisenhower, the obsessive priority of American foreign policy, to invade Cuba, proceeded without pause. On the beaches and in the jungles of Guatemala, Nicaragua, and Florida, the Bay of Pigs invasion was being rehearsed. On the 13th of the month, 5 days after Kennedy's victory, Guatemalan military personnel broke out in armed rebellion against the government of General Miguel Ydigoras Fuentes, seizing 2 military bases and the port city of Puerto Barrios. Reports of the number of officers involved in the uprising vary from 45 to 120, the latter figure representing almost half the Guatemalan Army's officer corps. The officers commanded as many as 3,000 troops, a significant percentage of the armed forces. Their goals, it later developed, were more nationalistic than ideological. The officers were fed up with the corruption in the Ydigoras regime and in the army, and were particularly incensed about the use of their country by a foreign power as a springboard for an invasion of Cuba, some of them being admirers of Fidel Castro for his nationalist policies. One of the dissident officers later characterized the American training base in Guatemala as a shameful violation of our national sovereignty. And why was it permitted? Because our government is a puppet. The rebellion was crushed within a matter of days, reportedly by the sole power of the Guatemalan Air Force. Some years later, a different picture was to emerge. The rebels were a force to be reckoned with. The ease with which they had taken over the 2 garrisons and the real possibility of their mutiny spreading to other bases set alarms ringing at the CIA base, a large coffee plantation in a remote corner of southwestern Guatemala, where the agency and the U.S. Air Force were training the army of Cuban exiles who were to launch the attack upon their homeland. The CIA feared, and rightly so, that a new regime would send them, the Cubans, and the whole operation packing. In Washington, President Eisenhower ordered U.S. naval and air units to patrol the Caribbean coast and shoot, if necessary, to prevent any communist-led invasion of Guatemala or Nicaragua. Eisenhower, like Ydigoras, saw the hand of international communism, particularly Cuba, behind the uprising, although no evidence of this was ever presented. It was almost ironic in light of the fact that it was the conspiracy of the 2 leaders to overthrow Cuba that was one of the reasons for the uprising, and that the U.S. naval fleet ordered into action was deployed from Guantanamo Naval Base in Cuba, an American military installation present in that country against the vociferous objections of the Cuban government. In Guatemala, meanwhile, the CIA decided upon a solution to the dilemma that was both remarkably simple and close at hand. American and Cuban pilots took off from their training ground and bombed and strafed rebel headquarters outside Guatemala City, and bombed the town and airfield of Puerto Barrios. Caught completely by surprise and defenseless against this superior force, the rebels' insurrection collapsed. Back at the coffee plantation, the CIA resumed the function which had been so rudely interrupted, the preparation for the overthrow of the Cuban government. No announcement about the bombings was made in Washington, nor did a report appear in the American press. The CIA actions were probably not widely known about in Guatemala either, but it became public knowledge that President Ydigoras had asked Washington for the naval and air support, and had even instructed the Guatemalan ambassador in Washington to get in touch immediately with Assistant Secretary of State for Inter-American Affairs Thomas Mann to coordinate your action. Thus it was that the Guatemalan president, needing afterward to distance himself a little from so much Yankee protection, was moved to state that countries like Guatemala are at a disadvantage because Cuba is a satellite of powerful Russia, but we are not a satellite of the United States. The final irony was that some of the dissident officers who went into hiding became more radicalized by their experience. During their revolt, they had spurned offers of support from some of the peasants, though this would necessarily have been very limited in any case, because fighting for social change was not at all what the officers had in mind at the time. But as fugitives, thrown into greater contact with the peasants, they eventually came to be moved by the peasants' pressing need for land and for a way out of their wretched existence. In 1962, several of the officers were to emerge as leaders of a guerrilla movement which incorporated November 13 as part of its name. In their opening statement, the guerrillas declared, "Democracy vanished from our country long ago. No people can live in a country where there is no democracy. That is why the demand for changes is mounting in our country. We can no longer carry on in this way. We must overthrow the Ydigoras government and set up a government which represents human rights, seeks ways and means to save our country from its hardships, and pursues a serious self-respecting foreign policy. A simple sentiment stated even simpler, but as we shall see, a movement fated to come up against the wishes of the United States. For if Washington could casually do away with an elected government in Guatemala, as it had in 1954, it could be moved by a guerrilla army only as rocks by waves or the moon by howling wolves. 24. France/Algeria 1960s.
L'État, c'est la CIA.
When John F. Kennedy assumed office in January 1961, he was confronted with a CIA at the zenith of its power and credibility. In the agency's first 14 years, no formal congressional investigation of it had taken place, nor had any watchdog committee been established. For investigations of the CIA by independent task forces during this period had ensured that everything relating to things covert remained just that. With the exception of the U-2 incident the year before, no page one embarrassments, scandals, or known failures, what had received a measure of publicity, the coups in Guatemala and Iran, were widely regarded as CIA success stories. White House denials and a compliant media had kept the agency's misadventure in Indonesia in 1958 from the public scrutiny it deserved. It is probable that the CIA had more staff officers overseas, under official and unofficial covers, than the State Department, and this in addition to its countless paid agents. Often the CIA chief of station had been in a particular country longer than the American ambassador, had more money at his disposal, and exerted more influence. When it suited their purposes, agency officers would completely bypass the ambassador and normal protocol to deal directly with the country's head of state and other high officials. The CIA had its own military capabilities, including its own air force, for all intents and purposes its own foreign service with, indeed, its own foreign policy, though never at cross purposes with fundamental U.S. Cold War, anti-communist ideology and goals. Seemingly without fear of exposure or condemnation, the agency felt free to carry out sundry Dr. Strangelove experiments involving control of the human mind and all manner of biochemical weapons, including the release of huge amounts of bacteria into the air in the United States, which resulted in much illness and a number of deaths. It was all very heady stuff for the officers of the CIA, playing their men's games with their boys' toys. They recognized scarcely any limitation upon their freedom of action. British colonial governors they were, and all the world was India. Then, in mid-April, came the disaster at the Bay of Pigs in Cuba. The international repercussions had barely begun to subside when the agency was again catapulted into world headlines. On April 22nd, 4 French generals in Algeria seized power in an attempt to maintain the country's union with France. The putsch, which held out but 4 days, was a direct confrontation with French President Charles de Gaulle, who had dramatically proclaimed a policy leading not to an Algeria governed from France, but to an Algerian Algeria. The next day, the leftist Italian newspaper, Illinois Pays, stated that it is not by chance that some people in Paris are accusing the American Secret Service headed by Allen Dulles of having participated in the plot of the 4 ultra-generals. Whether Il Pays was the original source of this charge remains a mystery. Dulles himself later wrote that the Italian daily was one of the first to launch it, emphasis added. He expressed the opinion that this particular myth was a communist plant, pure and simple. The New York Times reported that the rumors apparently began circulating by word of mouth on the day of the putsch, a report echoed by the Washington Star, which added that some of the rumors were launched by minor officials at the Élysée Palace itself, who gave reporters to understand that the general's plot was backed by strongly anti-communist elements in the United States government and military services. Whatever its origins, the story spread rapidly around the world, and the French Foreign Office refused to refute the allegation. Le Monde asserted in a front-page editorial on April 28th that the behavior of the United States during the recent crisis was not particularly skillful. It seems established that American agents more or less encouraged Chal, the leader of the putsch. President Kennedy, of course, knew nothing of all this. Reports from all sources were in agreement that if the CIA had indeed been involved in the putsch, it had been so for 2 reasons. 1, the concern that if Algeria were granted its independence, communists would soon come to power, being those in the ranks of the National Liberation Front, NLF, which had been fighting the French army in Algeria for several years, the legendary Battle of Algiers. It was with the NLF that de Gaulle was expected to negotiate a settlement. 2, the hope that it would precipitate the downfall of de Gaulle, an end desired because the French president was a major stumbling block to US aspirations concerning NATO. Among other things, he refused to incorporate French troops into an integrated military command, and he opposed exclusive American control over the alliance's nuclear weapons. By all accounts, it appears that the rebel officers had counted on support from important military and civilian quarters in France to extend the rebellion to the home country and overthrow de Gaulle. Fanciful as this may sound, the fact remains that the French government took the possibility seriously. French Premier Michel Debré went on television to warn the nation of an imminent paratroop invasion of the Paris area and to urge mass opposition. Reaction in the American press to the allegations had an unmistakably motley quality. Washington Post columnist Marquis Childs said that the French were so shocked by the general's coup that they had to find a scapegoat. At the same time, he quoted one of the highest officials of the French government as saying, "Of course, your government, neither your State Department nor your president, had anything to do with this. But when you have so many hundreds of agents in every part of the world, it is not to be wondered at that some of them should have got in touch with the generals in Algiers." Time magazine discounted the story, saying too that the United States was being made a scapegoat and that the CIA had become a favorite target in recent weeks. James Reston wrote in the New York Times that the CIA was involved in an embarrassing liaison with the anti-Gaullist officers who staged last week's insurrection in Algiers. The Bay of Pigs and Algerian events have increased the feeling in the White House that the CIA has gone beyond the bounds of an objective intelligence-gathering agency and has become the advocate of men and policies that have embarrassed the administration. However, C.L. Sulzberger, who had been the man at the New York Times closest to the CIA since its founding, stated flatly that no American in Algeria had to do with any insurrectional leader. No consular employee saw any rebel. A few days later, though, Secretary of State Dean Rusk disclosed that an emissary of the rebellious French generals had visited the U.S. consulate in Algiers to request aid, but had been summarily rebuffed. The affair, wrote Sulzberger, was a deliberate effort to poison Franco-American relationships, begun in Moscow but abetted by anti-American French officials and naive persons in Washington. When one checks, one finds all this began in a Moscow Izvestia article April 25th. This last, as we have seen, was incorrect. Dean of American columnists Walter Lippmann, who had seen de Gaulle in Paris shortly before the putsch, wrote, "The reason why the French government has not really exculpated the CIA of encouraging the Algerian rebel generals is that it was already so angry with the CIA for meddling in French internal politics. The French grievance, justified or not, has to do with recent French legislation for the French nuclear weapon, and the alleged effort of CIA agents to interfere with that legislation." Newsweek repeated the claim that it was French officials who had been the main sources of the rumors in the first place. When challenged by the American administration, the French denied their authorship and tended to soften the charges. Some French officials eventually declared the matter to be closed, though they still failed to explicitly rule out the allegations about American involvement. In early May 1961, L'Express, the widely read French liberal weekly, published what was perhaps the first detailed account of the mysterious affair. Their Algerian correspondent, Claude Crieff, reported, "Both in Paris and Washington the facts are now known, though they will never be publicly admitted. In private, the highest French personalities make no secret of it. What they say is this: the CIA played a direct part in the Algiers coup, and certainly weighed heavily on the decision taken by ex-General Chal to start his putsch. Not long before, Chal had held the position of NATO Commander-in-Chief, Allied Forces Central Europe, as a result of which he had been in daily contact with U.S. military officers." Crieff wrote that certain American officials in NATO and the Pentagon had encouraged Chal, and that the general had several meetings with CIA officers who told him that to get rid of de Gaulle would render the free world a great service. Crieff noted that Chal, despite an overweening ambition, was very cautious and serious-minded. "All the people who know him well are deeply convinced that he had been encouraged by the CIA to go ahead." At a luncheon in Washington the previous year, Jacques Soustelle, the former Governor-General of Algeria who had made public his disagreement with de Gaulle's Algeria policy, had met with CIA officials, including Richard Bissell, head of covert operations. Soustelle convinced the agency officials, according to Crieff, that Algeria would become, through de Gaulle's blundering, a Soviet base. This luncheon became something of a cause célèbre in the speculation concerning the CIA's possible role. The New York Times and others reported that it had been given by the agency for Sustel. U.S. officials, however, insisted that the luncheon had been arranged by someone at the French embassy at Sustel's request. This French official, they said, had been present throughout the meeting, and thus there could have been no dark conspiracy. Why the French embassy would host a luncheon for a prominent and bitter foe of de Gaulle, a man who only 2 months earlier had been kicked out of de Gaulle's cabinet for his ultra-sympathies, was not explained. Nor, for that matter, why in protocol-minded Washington of all places the CIA would attend. In any event, it seems somewhat fatuous to imply that this was the only chance Sustel and the CIA had to talk during his stay in the United States, which lasted more than a week. A clandestine meeting in Madrid also received wide currency within the controversy. Kreef dates it April 12, 1961, and describes it as a meeting of various foreign agents, including members of the CIA and the Algiers conspirators, who disclosed their plans to the CIA men. The Americans were reported to have angrily complained that de Gaulle's policy was paralyzing NATO and rendering the defense of Europe impossible, and assured the generals that if they and their followers succeeded, Washington would recognize the new Algerian government within 48 hours. It may well be that the French government did have evidence of the CIA's complicity, but in the unnatural world of international diplomacy, this would not necessarily lead to an unambiguous public announcement. Such a move could result in an open confrontation between France and the United States, a predicament both sides could be expected to take pains to avoid. Moreover, it might put the French in the position of having to do something about it. And what could they do? Breaking relations with the United States was not a realistic option. Neither were the French in any position to retaliate economically or militarily. But French leaders were too angry to simply let the matter pass into obscurity. Thus, to complete the hypothetical scenario, they took the backdoor approach with all its shortcomings. In a similar vein, the United States knew that the Russians, for at least 1 year, were intercepting telephone calls in the US of government and congressional officials, but said nothing publicly because it was unable to end the practice for technical reasons. And this concerned an enemy, not an ally. Between 1958 and the middle of the 1960s, there occurred some 30 serious assassination attempts upon the life of Charles de Gaulle, in addition to any number of planned attempts which didn't advance much beyond the planning stage. A world record for a head of state, it is said. In at least one of the attempts, the CIA may have been a co-conspirator against the French president. By the mid-1960s, differences between de Gaulle and Washington concerning NATO had almost reached the breaking point. In February 1966, he gave NATO and the United States a deadline to either place their military bases in France under French control or dismantle them. In 1975, the Chicago Tribune featured a front-page story which read in part, "Congressional leaders have been told of Central Intelligence Agency involvement in a plot by French dissidents to assassinate the late French President Charles de Gaulle." Within the last 2 weeks, a CIA representative disclosed sketchy details of the scheme. Sometime in the mid-1960s, probably in 1965 or 1966, dissidents in the de Gaulle government are said to have made contact with the CIA to seek help in a plot to murder the French leader. Which party instigated the contact was not clear. According to the CIA briefing officer, discussions were held on how best to eliminate de Gaulle, who by then had become a thorn in the side of the Johnson administration because of his ouster of American military bases from French soil and his demands that United States forces be withdrawn from the Indochina War. Thus, the following plan is said to have evolved after discussions between CIA personnel and the dissident French. There is, however, no evidence the plot got beyond the talking stage. A hired assassin, armed with a poison ring, was to be slipped into a crowd of old soldiers of France when General de Gaulle was to be the host at a reception for them. The killer would make his appearance late in the day when it could be presumed de Gaulle's hand would be weary and perhaps even numb from shaking hundreds of hands. The assassin would clasp the general's hand in lethal friendship, and de Gaulle would fail to detect the tiny pinprick of poison as it penetrated his flesh. The executioner would stroll off to become lost in the crowd as the poison began coursing through de Gaulle's veins either to his heart or brain, depending on the deadly poison used. How quickly death would come was not divulged, if that was even discussed at the time. In the outline presented to the congressional leaders, there is no hint of what the CIA's actual role might have been had the plot reached fruition. The dissidents involved in the alleged plot were embittered French army officers and former Algerian settlers who still bore deep resentment toward de Gaulle for having sold out French honor by his retreat from the North African colony. There was no mention in the reported CIA testimony about any involvement of Lyndon Johnson, although it was well known that there was no love lost between Johnson and de Gaulle. The French leader was firmly convinced that the United States was behind the failure of his trip to South America in 1964. He believed that the CIA had used its network of agents in South America to prevent a big turnout of crowds. There is some evidence to indicate that the general was not just paranoid. In 1970, Dr. Alfred Steppen, a professor of political science at Yale, testified before Congress about his experience in South America in 1964 when he was a journalist for The Economist. When de Gaulle was going to make his trip through Latin America, many of the Latin Americans interviewed officers of various embassies said that they were under very real pressure by various American groups not to be very warm towards de Gaulle, because we considered Latin America within the United States area of influence. After the appearance of the Chicago Tribune story, CIA Director William Colby confirmed that foreigners had approached the agency with a plot to kill de Gaulle. The agency rejected the idea, Colby said, but he did not know if the French government had been advised of the plot. It is not clear whether the incident referred to by Colby was related to the one discussed in the Tribune. In the early evening of Monday, November 9th, 1970, Charles de Gaulle died peacefully at the age of 80, sitting in his armchair watching a sentimental television serial called Nanu.
25 Ecuador 1960 a 1963.
A textbook of dirty tricks. If the Guinness Book of World Records included a category for cynicism, one could suggest the CIA's creation of leftist organizations which condemned poverty, disease, illiteracy, capitalism, and the United States in order to attract committed militants and their money away from legitimate leftist organizations. The tiny nation of Ecuador in the early 1960s was, as it remains today, a classic of banana republic underdevelopment, virtually at the bottom of the economic heap in South America. A society in which 1% of the population received an income comparable to United States upper-class standards, while 2/3 of the people had an average family income of about $10 per month. People simply outside the money economy, with little social integration or participation in the national life. A tale told many times in Latin America. In September 1960, a new government headed by José María Velasco Ibarra came to power. Velasco had won a decisive electoral victory, running on a vaguely liberal, populist, something-for-everyone platform. He was no Fidel Castro, he was not even a socialist, but he earned the wrath of the U.S. State Department and the CIA by his unyielding opposition to the two stated priorities of American policy in Ecuador: breaking relations with Cuba and clamping down hard on activists of the Communist Party and those to their left. Over the next 3 years, in pursuit of those goals, the CIA left as little as possible to chance.
Un véritable textbook en cover subversion technique unfolded.
In its pages could be found the following, based upon the experiences of Philip Agee, a CIA officer who spent this period in Ecuador. Almost all political organizations of significance, from the far left to the far right, were infiltrated, often at the highest levels. Amongst other reasons, the left was infiltrated to channel young radicals away from support to Cuba and from anti-Americanism. The right to instigate and coordinate activities along the lines of CIA priorities. If, at a point in time, there was no organization that appeared well-suited to serve a particular need, then one would be created. Or a new group of concerned citizens would appear, fronted with noted personalities, which might place a series of notices in leading newspapers denouncing the penetration of the government by the extreme left and demanding a break with Cuba. Or one of the noted personalities would deliver a speech prepared by the CIA, and then a newspaper editor or a well-known columnist would praise it, both gentlemen being on the CIA payroll. Some of these fronts had an actual existence. For others, even their existence was phony. On one occasion, the CIA officer who had created the non-existent Ecuadorian Anti-Communist Front was surprised to read in his morning paper that a real organization with that name had been founded. He changed the name of his organization to Ecuadorian Anti-Communist Action. Wooing the working class came in for special emphasis. An alphabet soup of labor organizations, sometimes hardly more than names on stationery, were created, altered, combined, liquidated, and new ones created again, in an almost frenzied attempt to find the right combination to compete with existing left-oriented unions and take national leadership away from them. Union leaders were invited to attend various classes conducted by the CIA in Ecuador or in the United States, all expenses paid, in order to impart to them the dangers of communism to the union movement and to select potential agents. This effort was not without its irony either. CIA agents would sometimes jealously vie with each other for the best positions in these CIA-created labor organizations, and at times Ecuadorian organizations would meet in international conferences with CIA labor fronts from other countries, with almost all of the participants blissfully unaware of who was who or what was what. In Ecuador, as throughout most of Latin America, the agency planted phony anti-communist news items in cooperating newspapers. These items would then be picked up by other CIA stations in Latin America and disseminated through a CIA-owned news agency, a CIA-owned radio station, or through countless journalists being paid on a piecework basis, in addition to the item being picked up unwittingly by other media, including those in the United States. Anti-communist propaganda and news distortion, often of the most far-fetched variety, written in CIA offices would also appear in Latin American newspapers as unsigned editorials of the papers themselves. In virtually every department of the Ecuadorian government could be found men occupying positions, high and low, who collaborated with the CIA for money and or their own particular motivation. At one point, the agency could count amongst this number the men who were second and third in power in the country. These government agents would receive the benefits of information obtained by the CIA through electronic eavesdropping or other means, enabling them to gain prestige and promotion, or consolidate their current position in the rough and tumble of Ecuadorian politics. A high-ranking minister of leftist tendencies, on the other hand, would be the target of a steady stream of negative propaganda from any or all sources in the CIA arsenal. Staged demonstrations against him would further increase the pressure on the president to replace him. The Postmaster General, along with other post office employees, all members in good standing of the CIA payroll club, regularly sent mail arriving from Cuba and the Soviet bloc to the agency for its perusal, while customs officials and the Director of Immigration kept the agency posted on who went to or came from Cuba. When a particularly suitable target returned from Cuba, he would be searched at the airport and documents prepared by the CIA would be found on him. These documents, publicized as much as possible, might include instructions on how to intensify hatred between classes, or some provocative language designed to cause a split in Communist Party ranks. Generally, the documents verified the worst fears of the public about communist plans to take over Ecuador under the masterminding of Cuba or the Soviet Union. At the same time, perhaps, implicating an important Ecuadorian leftist whose head the agency was after. Similar revelations, staged by CIA stations elsewhere in Latin America, would be publicized in Ecuador as a warning that Ecuador was next. Agency financing of conservative groups in a quasi-religious campaign against Cuba and atheistic communism helped to seriously weaken President Velasco's power among the poor, primarily Indians, who had voted overwhelmingly for him, but who were even more deeply committed to their religion. If the CIA wished to know how the president was reacting to this campaign, it need only turn to his physician, its agent, Dr. Felipe Ovalle, who would report that his patient was feeling considerable strain as a result. CIA agents would bomb churches or right-wing organizations and make it appear to be the work of leftists. They would march in left-wing parades displaying signs and shouting slogans of a very provocative anti-military nature, designed to antagonize the armed forces and hasten a coup. The agency did not always get away clean with its dirty tricks. During the election campaign, on March 19, 1960, two senior colonels who were the CIA's main liaison agents within the National Police participated in a riot aimed at disrupting a Velasco demonstration. Agency Officer Bob Weatherwax was in the forefront directing the police during the riot in which 5 Velasco supporters were killed and many wounded. When Velasco took office, he had the 2 colonels arrested and Weatherwax was asked to leave the country. CIA-supported activities were carried out without the knowledge of the American ambassador. When the Cuban embassy publicly charged the agency with involvement in various anti-Cuban activities, the American ambassador issued a statement that had everyone in the CIA station smiling. Stated the ambassador, "The only agents in Ecuador who are paid by the United States are the technicians invited by the Ecuadorian government to contribute to raising the living standards of the Ecuadorian people." Finally, in November 1961, the military acted. Velasco was forced to resign and was replaced by Vice President Carlos Julio Orozmana. There were at this time two prime candidates for the vice presidency. One was the vice president of the Senate, a CIA agent. The other was the rector of Central University, a political moderate. The day that Congress convened to make their choice, a notice appeared in a morning paper announcing support for the rector by the Communist Party and a militant leftist youth organization. The notice had been placed by a columnist for the newspaper who was the principal propaganda agent for the CIA's Quito station. The rector was compromised rather badly, the denials came too late, and the CIA man won. His agency salary was increased from $700 to $1,000 a month. Orozmana soon proved no more acceptable to the CIA than Velasco. All operations continued, particularly the campaign to break relations with Cuba, which Orozmana steadfastly refused to do. The deadlock was broken in March 1962 when a military garrison, led by Colonel Aurelio Naranjo, gave Orozmana 72 hours to send the Cubans packing and fire the leftist Minister of Labor. There is no need to point out here who Naranjo's financial benefactor was. Orozmana complied with the ultimatum, booting out the Czech and Polish delegations as well at the behest of the new cabinet which had been forced upon him. At the CIA station in Quito, there was a champagne victory celebration. Elsewhere in Ecuador, people angry about the military's domination and desperate about their own lives took to arms. But on this occasion, like others, it amounted to naught. A small band of people, poorly armed and trained, infiltrated by agents, their every move known in advance, confronted by a battalion of paratroopers, superbly armed and trained by the United States. That was in the field. In press reports, the small band grew to hundreds, armed not only to the teeth, but with weapons from outside the country, read Cuba, and the whole operation very carefully planned at the Communist Party Congress the month before. On July 11, 1963, the presidential palace in Quito was surrounded by tanks and troops. Orozmana was out, a junta was in. Their first act was to outlaw communism. Communists and other extreme leftists were rounded up and jailed. The arrest campaign being facilitated by data from the CIA's subversive control watch list. Standard at many agency stations, this list would include not only the subject's name, but the names and addresses of his relatives and friends and the places he frequented, anything to aid in tracking him down when the time came. Civil liberties were suspended, the 1964 elections canceled. Another tale told many times in Latin America. And during these 3 years, what were the American people told about this witch's brew of covert actions carried out, supposedly in their name? Very little, if anything, if the New York Times is any index. Not once during the entire period, up to and including the coup, was any indication given in any article or editorial on Ecuador that the CIA or any other arm of the US government had played any role whatever in any event which had occurred in that country. This is the way the writings read, even if one looks back at them with the advantage of knowledge and hindsight and reads between the lines. There is a solitary exception. Following the coup, we find a tiny announcement on the very bottom of page 20 that Havana Radio had accused the United States of instigating the military takeover. The Cuban government had been making public charges about American activities in Ecuador regularly, but this was the first one to make the New York Times. The question must be asked, why were these charges deemed unworthy of reporting or comment, let alone investigation? 26. The Congo 1960 to 1964. The assassination of Patrice Lumumba. Within days of its independence from Belgium on June 30th, 1960, the land long known as the Belgian Congo, and later as Zaire, was engulfed in strife and chaos as multiple individuals, tribes, and political groups struggled for dominance or independence. For the next several years, the world press chronicled the train of Congolese governments, the endless confusion of personalities and conspiracies, exotic place names like Stanleyville and Leopoldville, shocking stories of European hostages and white mercenaries, the brutality and the violence from all quarters with its racist overtones. Into this disorder, the Western powers were naturally drawn, principally Belgium to protect its vast mineral investments, and the United States, mindful of the fabulous wealth as well, and obsessed, as usual, with fighting communism. Successive American administrations of Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson looking through Cold War binoculars perceived an east-west battleground. The CIA station in the Congo cabled Washington in August that embassy and station believe Congo experiencing classic communist effort to take over government. CIA Director Alan Dulles warned of a communist takeover of the Congo with disastrous consequences for the interests of the free world. At the same time, Dulles authorized a crash program fund of up to $100,000 to replace the existing government of Patrice Lumumba with a pro-Western group. It's not known what criteria the CIA applied to determine that Lumumba's government was going communist, but we do know how the Washington Post arrived at the same conclusion. Western diplomats see the part of the Congo controlled by volatile Premier Patrice Lumumba sliding slowly but surely into the communist bloc. Apart from the fevered activity of communist bloc nations here, the pattern of events is becoming apparent to students of communist policy. Premier Lumumba's startling changes of position, his open challenge of the United Nations and Secretary General Dag Hammarskjöld, his constant agitation of the largely illiterate Congolese can be explained in no other way, veteran observers say. Years later, Under Secretary of State C. Douglas Dillon told a Senate investigating committee, the Church Committee, that the National Security Council and President Eisenhower had believed in 1960 that Lumumba was a very difficult, if not impossible, person to deal with, and was dangerous to the peace and safety of the world. This statement moved author Jonathan Quitney to observe how far beyond the dreams of a barefoot jungle postal clerk in 1956, that in a few short years he would be dangerous to the peace and safety of the world. The perception seems insane, particularly coming from the National Security Council, which really does have the power to end all human life within hours. Patrice Lumumba became the Congo's first prime minister after his party received a plurality of the votes in national elections. He called for the nation's economic as well as political liberation and did not shy away from contact with socialist countries. At the Independence Day ceremonies, he probably managed to alienate all the attending foreign dignitaries with his speech, which read in part, "Our lot was 80 years of colonial rule. We have known tiring labor exacted in exchange for salary, which did not allow us to satisfy our hunger. We have known ironies, insults, blows which we had to endure morning, noon, and night because we were Negroes. We have known that the law was never the same depending on whether it concerned a white or a Negro. We have known the atrocious sufferings of those banished for political opinions or religious beliefs. We have known that there were magnificent houses for the whites in the cities and tumble-down straw huts for the Negroes. In 1960, it must be borne in mind, this was indeed radical and inflammatory language in such a setting. On July 11th, the province of Katanga, home to the bulk of the Congo's copper, cobalt, uranium, gold, and other mineral wealth, announced that it was seceding. Belgium, the principal owner of this fabulous wealth, never had any intention of giving up real control of the country, and it now supported the move for Katanga's independence, perceiving the advantage of having its investments housed in their own little country, not accountable to nor paying taxes to the central government in Leopoldville. Katanga, moreover, was led by Moise Tshombe, a man eminently accommodating to and respectful of whites and their investments. The Eisenhower administration supported the Belgian military intervention on behalf of Katanga. Indeed, the American embassy had previously requested such intervention. Influencing this policy, in addition to Washington's ideological aversion to Lumumba, was the